Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're watching from around the world. Thank you for joining us for the beginning of this job search and career series. My name, as Alyssa said, is Jason Alba, and I have been a Pluralsight author since 2012. I have also been in the career and job search space since 2006 when I lost my job and started a job search which turned out to be a grand failure. And I pulled back from the job search and tried to analyze and figure out and understand what the job search process was. And in the process of doing that, I actually created my own company and have been in the job search and career space since 2006. So my company is jibberjobber.com. You'll see that on the slide. And that's basically a CRM for job seeker. It replaces the job search spreadsheet. I also wrote some books. My first one was on LinkedIn essentially for job seekers, but really for anybody. And that got me on a speaking tour and all kinds of things that really launched and propelled me more into the jobs and the career space. And so when Pluralsight approached me about creating courses for them, I'd already created a number of job search courses and had been speaking around the US on job search and careers, and it's something that I'm very, very passionate about. So what we're going to do today is just do a real quick housekeeping and introduction to the whole series, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time on interviews. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the question spot on Zoom. I will be monitoring those and try and answer every single question by the time we're done. So on Pluralsight, I have 34 courses right now. I'm working on my next one, which is really cool and exciting. It should be out in the next week or two. If you're a Pluralsight user, you might not know that you can actually go to your favorite authors and click follow. And when a new course of theirs comes out, you'll get an email, which is really cool. So if you're interested in careers or soft skills, follow me and then go find other authors that talk about the same stuff and follow them. I have been on the interview table on both sides many times, plenty of times. I've interviewed people from interns all the way through senior developers and project managers, et cetera, et cetera. And I love interviewing people, partially because I love to get to know who people are. And so that's really where I'm coming at this from. And that's kind of the perspective that I'm approaching this from. I also, of course, have had plenty of interviewing experience as a job seeker, and that also has persuaded the information I'll be sharing with you. On the screen, you can also see that I'm on Twitter at Jason Alba, and so go ahead and follow me there. And if you have any questions outside of today's content, you can ask me or direct message me there. On Pluralsight, you can search Alba, just ALBA, and you'll find my courses. All right, so today what we're going to do is talk about just real quick, we'll go over the Pluralsight seminar series and what the 6 topics are. And then specifically for the job search interview questions, we're going to talk about the purpose of interviews. It's really important to understand why you're being interviewed and the purpose of the questions. There's some really dumb questions out there, and we'll talk about that. And why people ask questions, which has a direct impact on how you answer questions. We'll talk about first impressions and logistics, getting to the interview, planning, stuff like that. We'll talk about specific interview questions and kind of the anatomy of the questions. One of my very favorite topics is what I call mini stories. And when I describe that, I think you'll say, oh yeah, I kind of heard of this before. This was something really profound that I learned about in my job search, where I thought this is an excellent way to communicate what our value is in a job search interview, but also in other places. We'll talk about this thing that's called mock interviews, which originally I absolutely disliked. And I really didn't want to do mock interviews. I didn't think that I needed to do mock interviews. And then I did mock interviews, and the outcome was really amazing. So we'll talk about that. And then one of my favorite topics, if you've seen any of my Pluralsight courses, I talk a lot about follow-up and the power of follow-up. So let's jump in. Oh, sorry. We'll go over a couple other things. So you can see my the download of these slides at jibberjobber.com/ps. That should be up by the end of the day. And then also some of the links that I talk about or some relevant information will also be there. This is where I'm going to post information and slides and links for this entire series. So jibberjobber.com/ps. In this seminar, we're going to go over 6 different things. So today we'll talk about interviews. Tomorrow we'll talk about personal branding, which is one of my favorite topics, because I didn't have a brand and I didn't understand branding and I didn't understand the power of personal branding. But once I started to really get it, I thought that everybody needs this. Everybody has to understand the hows and whys and whats of personal branding. Next week, we'll talk about job search processes and systems. And on Monday and then on Tuesday, we'll talk about networking and a tactic that I call networking on steroids, which is one of my favorite job search tactics. And then in 2 weeks from today, we'll talk about onboarding yourself. I have a course on how to onboard yourself in a new company once you land your job. And the reason why I promote this course is in the job search, it feels lonely. It feels like you're never going to end the job search. It feels like, you're not going to get there, or at least there's times when it feels like you're not making any progress. And one of the things I wanted to do was give you some vision and some hope and like, hey, you will land a job again. And when you do, here's what I want you to do. And so this is a very proactive course. Of course, the last job I had, there was this onboarding process, which was about 3 or 4 hours in a group and then a couple hours with my new boss. And that was about it. And the onboarding yourself that I talk about is what can I do in the first 30, 60, 90 days to really hit the ground running and do very well. And the final session that we'll have is on personal finances. I am really intrigued with personal finances, and I like the idea of creating wealth. I like the idea of not being in debt. And I think it's interesting that a lot of people in our field in technology make really a lot of money, like above average, way above average. And it's interesting to me to think about what to do with that money. And so that's what we'll talk about the last day. We should also talk a little bit about finances in the job search, because there are some nuances of how to manage your finances and things to think about when you don't have income coming in. All right, so just four or five courses that I wanted to mention. Again, these are going to be at jibberjobber.com/ps. So the first one is by Alan Ackman. He has I think he has 9 courses in Pluralsight, a lot of soft skills. And the one I pulled out from him is on storytelling. And the reason why I talk about this one or I suggest this one is because we need to tell our story. We need to figure out how we can communicate. And I'll talk more about that tomorrow in the personal branding course. But specifically with regard to interviewing, interviews are little stories. And remember, one of the agenda items for today is on mini stories. And I have a very structured way of creating mini stories, but I want you to start thinking about how you can tell your own story. And for some of us, we've been trained, and this can be a cultural thing or a family thing or whatever, but we've been trained to not talk about ourselves, or in other words, to not brag about ourselves. And so, and we need to get out of that. We really have to get out of that idea, because for a long time, we're not allowed to talk about ourselves. And then we become a job seeker and it's like, well, tell me about yourself. And we're supposed to tell these stories. So if you're interested in telling better stories, go check out Alan's course on that. The next one is from Rob Morris, and it's titled Resumes, Job Seeking, and Interviews in Context. Pretty obvious why I recommend that one. Amber Israelson has one called Careers in IT, How to Get Your First Job. And if you listen to the very beginning of it, she talks to students and people that are just starting out. But really, a lot of what we talk about in the career And the job search and really the soft skill space is principle oriented. So no matter where you're at in your career, even if you're towards the end of your career, what she talks about and what we talk about are principles. So don't let the talk of and to students be a hang up for you. In her course, she has a module that is over an hour just on the interview, job search interviews. The last one is my course called The Successful Technical Interview for Interviewers. Now, this is interesting because I was asked to create a course for the interviewer, not for the interviewee. But this is a bit of a, I had a dual purpose on this. I want, and I tell my job seekers to watch this course because I want you to know what interviewers are being trained to do. You need to understand how they're thinking and why they're thinking and what are the types of questions they could and should ask and why are they asking those questions. And so this is, if you subscribe to The Art of War, the book, The Art of War, one of the principles in there is to understand your enemy. And I'm not saying that the interviewer is your enemy by any means. They're not your enemy, but they are on the other side of the table. And I really want you to understand how they're thinking and what they've been trained to do and how to think. All right, so let's start off with the purpose of interviews. And just a real quick housekeeping note. If you're seeing my slide really, really big and my face really, really small, you can change that. You can toggle back and forth. So that's on everybody that's watching. You can adjust that on your own. I am going to be not slide heavy. That's pretty much most of the slides that I'm going to share. I have a few towards the end, but most of this is just you and me and my face. So what are the purposes of the interview? When I think about bringing somebody in to have an interview, there are two things that I'm looking for. The first thing is, can you do the job? Are you technically proficient? Okay, that actually, before I even bring you into the interview, I will have made some assessments based on any information that I've gotten from you. So this includes your cover letter, and I am a firm believer in sending a cover letter. Just real quick on that. A lot of people in the resume and the career coaching space are having debates about, well, is the resume dead? Because we have things like LinkedIn profiles and your GitHub profile and stuff like that. So I don't really need a resume if I have those things, right? Well, I don't believe that at all. And one of the reasons why, it goes back to one of my first jobs where I actually got a job through a very unconventional method. And at the very end, after I was offered the job, my new boss said, oh, by the way, can you fill out this application? And it looked like a McDonald's application. It was just this really long form of all these fields. And I thought, they hired a lot of entry-level people at that job. And my thought was, why am I filling out this application? We've already made the decision, but he needed it for HR. And just like that was in one of my earlier jobs, it's the same way today. We might get a job kind of, through unconventional means, through networking and stuff like that. And they've already made decisions on bringing us in, but they still need to check all of the HR boxes. And one of those things, and I've had this experience before, one of those things is that we need to have a resume in their ATS, in the company's ATS, just so HR can have a record of us and push us through the whole onboarding process. So are resumes dead? Or are they going to die? No. Are cover letters dead? A lot of people say you don't need to send a cover letter, but I do. It's not a separate document, although sometimes it is if I upload on a job board. But if I'm sending in an email, my cover letter is the email, and it's 2 or 3 or 4 paragraphs, depending on what I feel like I need to communicate. So I look at your resume and I look at your cover letter and I look at your LinkedIn profile, and that's usually as far as I go. But if it's a more technical job, then I'm sure people are going to be looking at your GitHub profile and stuff like that. And I'm looking at all these things before I decide to bring you in. and I say, okay, yeah, I think based on what I'm seeing here, this person can actually do the job, okay? Now, once I get into the interview process, I want to validate some of those things that you have that I've looked at, okay? So if you said a certain thing on your resume, I might ask questions and with the purpose of why or you know, you said you can do this, or you said you have done this thing. Tell me more about that. You're not telling me much about things on your resume, right? Because it's bullets and very short lines, not even full sentences. I want to know the story behind that. And as I ask those types of questions, I start to understand more, yeah, this person really was involved in this project, and they really understood what the problems are, and they were really involved in coming up with the proper solutions, right? That's why I'm asking those questions. There was an interview with Elon Musk a number of years ago. This was on YouTube, and also it might be in my interview course, where somebody said, when you hire engineers, how do you know that you're hiring an engineer that's actually competent and proficient? And he says, well, you know, I ask about, you know, certain projects or problems that they were on and that they solved. And I ask them to explain, and I'm paraphrasing from something that I watched a few years ago. I asked them to explain what the problem was. Like, what was the complexity of the problem and what was the solution? Now, if you think about a team of 3 or 5 or 7 people that were on this problem, there's going to be a couple of people who knew the problem and the solution really intimately, right? They really dug down to try and figure out what the real issues were, and they could talk about those issues. And then they worked really hard on the breadth and the depth of the problem or the solution, and they could talk about that. That's the person that Elon wants to hire. He wants to hire the person who really went really deep on the problem and the solution. And then, of course, if you've worked on teams, you know there's some people who are on the team, but they haven't necessarily contributed much. They were there, and maybe they did have important contributions, but they didn't fully understand the scope and the breadth and the depth of what the problem was or what the solution was. And so he basically is asking, tell me about this. Tell me about the story. What were you trying to solve? And the deeper and better that can be explained, the more he knows, yeah, you really are technically proficient in this. I thought that was really interesting way of figuring out if somebody is proficient or not. One of the problems that we have in the technology space, and if you've ever seen anybody's resume, even yourself, you've probably seen this, where someone will list languages and then they'll put something like novice, intermediate, advanced, or expert, you know, things like that, or 1 through 5 stars or something like that. So the problem with that is it's very subjective. The person who is self-assessing is going in talking about how proficient they think they are in the technology, and they're going to have biases, right? I know people who are like, oh yeah, I've been doing JavaScript for 2 years, so I'm pretty much an expert now. And other people who are like, hey, I've been doing JavaScript for 10 years, and I know that I don't know a lot, so I'm going to say I'm intermediate. Right? And you can imagine that there's a lot of discrepancy between those two self-assessments. And then on the other side, the person who's reading that's going to be like, oh, they're expert. That must mean that they know how to do these really complex things. Or they're intermediate, so they probably don't know all of these advanced things. So I really dislike that. I remember one time I looked at an interview a resume from a kid. I think he was a junior in college. And he literally had 20 programming languages on his resume. He didn't have any proficiencies or anything. He just had languages listed. And he was really, really sharp. Like, he was a child prodigy-ish type thing. And that's what I heard. And I never met a child prodigy, and I didn't know what that meant. But as a hiring manager, here's what my thought was. my thought was, and if I could have had him in a room, I would have said this to him. I would have, or coached him, counseled him. I would have said, look, just because you read an article on this language doesn't mean you can put it on your resume, right? And so maybe he was really proficient in all of those things, but my bias was like, this guy is not telling the whole story. I want to understand your level of proficiency, and that's one of the reasons why I bring you in. One of the tools that I strongly encourage you to look at is the Pluralsight tool called Pluralsight Skill IQ. I didn't understand this when they first launched it, but once I dug into a little bit, I thought that this is one of the most brilliant things that Pluralsight has ever done, because I can now, and by the way, this is a free assessment, I can go in and get a skill IQ on various technologies or languages or methodologies or whatever. I can take an assessment, and then it gives me a score that tells me, like my IQ will be an actual score, like say 180 or something like that. And it'll give me a percentage of where, of how I compare to my peers, okay? So it gives you those two things. And now instead of saying I'm expert, I can say my Pluralsight skill IQ for Angular is a 180, and I'm in the 87th percentile of expertise on Angular. That has, for me as a hiring manager, that's going to help me understand your proficiency way more than saying that you're intermediate or advanced. As a matter of fact, the more I've thought about this, I talked to a partner who I own a software company with, and I said, our future hires need to take the skill IQ, because we've hired people based on what they've said without doing too much digging, and it has been too subjective. So we're at least going to use that as a tool, as a data point to help us understand what their proficiency level is. Other tools that I could use to determine what your proficiency is might be whiteboarding, which I think, according to everything that I've seen online, I feel comfortable saying that 100% of the people who do whiteboarding hate whiteboarding in the interview process. But it's one of the better ways that interviewers have to actually see what you know, but people can, there's a whole lot of problems with whiteboarding. Another way is that we can do pair programming and just sit down with somebody and have them go through some exercises and have that other developer assess their technical needs. So these are different ways to figure out what your proficiency is. Whether you do the skill IQ or not, which I highly recommend, there's no cost to it. I would say go in and do it for anything that you say that you have any proficiency in. Whether you do that or not, you need to figure out how you can communicate, yes, I am technically proficient. So here are some of the questions that I wrote down. What do you know? What are the skills? What are the areas of technology that you have familiarity with? And how proficient are you in those? What have you done? What have you built? What have you created? What projects have you been involved in? What can you do? I know as a hiring manager why I'm hiring you, and I know what projects I think I want to put you on, maybe a couple to choose from or whatever. And my question that I'm not asking you, but it's a question in my mind is, can this person really contribute to this role, right? So I need you to communicate that. And then the biggest question for me, because we're in technology, as a hiring manager and an owner of a company, my biggest question is, okay, I get this, but can you learn? So the message that I want you to take away from that is, if I'm asking questions about, do you know this, and do you know this, and what's your experience with that, and how long have you been doing this? One of the things I want to understand is, can you learn new technologies? Okay, so you need to figure out with yourself how to answer that question, whether they ask it to you or not. In technology, one of our big messages is, you know what, in the course of my career, I pick up a new technology every 1 to 3 years. And I know how my learning curve goes. I know what it takes for me to develop a level of expertise. not saying becoming an expert, but somewhere on that spectrum. I love learning, or I like learning, or maybe I don't like it, but I'm good at learning new technologies. I need the people that I hire, especially the senior people, to be really good at being able to learn new stuff. All right. So the first thing that I'm trying to get at with the interview is, can you do the job? The second question is really interesting. And this isn't a question I'm going to ask you, but it's a purpose of the interview is, are you going to be a match? Sometimes people say, are you going to be a cultural match? But that can get a little gray on what it means. So whether it's, are you going to fit into our culture, or are you just going to fit in? That's what I want to know. So here are the questions I wrote down. Will I like working with you? That's a really important question, because if I'm going to hire you, I don't want to hate working with you, right? One of the last interview rounds that I did, there was a guy that came in and he checked all the boxes. He had an awesome education, awesome experience, awesome everything, but he was so high energy. And I get it. Like, it's exciting and nervous, and the interview process isn't necessarily fun for many people. But this guy was almost bouncing off the walls. And when he left one of the group interviews that we did, one of the comments was, I can't work with that guy. There's way too much energy going on, right? So even though he was technically proficient and could do the job, he wasn't going to fit into our team, which was pretty chill. Like, we got stuff done and we liked getting stuff done, but the idea of having somebody that was so high energy come in. Now, I'm not saying you can't be high energy. And if you are high energy, I'm not saying that's a mark against you, but you figure out how to kind of rein it in, especially at the interview level. All right, the next one is, will I be proud to have hired you? So when I, as a manager, go to my meetings with other managers, am I going to be ashamed of having brought you on, or am I going to be proud and be like, have my peers say, wow, Jason, I can't believe you landed that person. That's awesome, right? So that's another question. Another one is, will you fit in and complement the team that you're being brought in on? Are you going to fit into that group and the company? Are you a good fit for the company? So these are the two purposes of the interviews. I really need to understand if you're technically proficient, and I need to understand if you're really going to fit in. The interesting thing is, most of the time, by the time I've brought you into your first and especially your second interview, I've already made my decision about your technical proficiency. I'm not asking more questions about your technical proficiency, especially at the second level interview or a second interview. All of my questions, even if they are technical, have to do with, am I going to like this, working with this person? Are they going to fit into our team? All right, so let's jump over to the next topic, which is first impressions and logistics. Remember, if you have questions, you can throw them into the questions box on the Zoom call. So one of the most important things that I want you to think about with first impressions and logistics is to plan. I need you to think about what you're going to wear, how you're going to present yourself, what you're going to say when you walk into that room and do that initial greeting. Even, this is kind of weird, but how are you going to sit? Okay, so let me just go through my notes here. I want you to think about your physical appearance and what you're going to wear. This is kind of tricky. I don't think you can go wrong dressing up, like in a suit or a nice dress or I don't know what it's called, suit, skirt, or whatever women typically wear that is like overdressed compared to like jeans and t-shirt or something like that. So I want you to think about that. Quick funny story. In the last interview that I did, I had 2 interviews. The first one, I wore my suit. The second one, I didn't want to wear my same suit, and I didn't fit into my second suit. So I actually went and got I bought a suit. It was like $200 or $300. It was ridiculous. It was money I didn't have, but I was like, I have to have a different suit. I can't wear the same set of clothes. And then the funny thing is, when I actually did the interview, I think it was online or whatever, but I didn't end up wearing that suit. So it's hanging in my closet, and it's been worn like once to try it on. But I did make the investment to make sure that I had the right physical appearance. Here's some of the logistics to think about for when you go there. I go there early. I go to the interview place early. I like to park in their parking lot, know how long it's going to take to get to their office. Sometimes I'll sit in my car for maybe a half an hour or so before I go in. I like to be about 10 minutes early. I don't like to be 30 minutes early. I think that's too much sitting in their lobby. But I like to, this helps me avoid traffic issues or accidents or getting lost or anything like that. And it also gives me about 20 or 30 minutes in the car to just clear my mind and just kind of get myself in the right frame of mind and purposefully think about what I'm about to do. I want you to be kind and be nice and be interested. I've had people that come in and to an interview and they're kind of dead. I have to draw stuff out of them. It doesn't seem like they're excited to actually be there. And if you're listening to this thinking, what? Does this actually happen? I'll tell you right now, there's people who actually go to interviews just so they can mark the box so they can claim unemployment. I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad or whatever. That's all on them. I don't really care. But some of your competitors are not interested in the job, right? And I want to know that you are interested in the job. One of the things that I want you to do to show that interest is to have smart questions. When you have smart questions, I'm like, oh, okay, this person's actually thought about this. They've done their research, unlike the 4 other people before them that asked kind of dumb questions. All right, I shouldn't have to say this, but you need to watch your language and you need to watch how you say things and how you talk about things and what you joke about. I think sometimes some of us, I like to use humor when I'm nervous, and it's gotten me in trouble more than once. But when you have that one opportunity to have your first interview, you need to be likable. We're looking for that cultural fit. So be careful how you talk and what you talk about. I was actually in an interview with somebody, and they did something that was offensive to I would say most people would be offended by it. But it was definitely offensive to women. And we had our boss in on that panel interview, and she was high level, and definitely could override or veto anything. And when this person did this thing that was funny, but it was offensive, I just kind of shook my head and I looked over to the boss and I thought, oh my gosh, this is not going to pass. And so just, I know we want to be fun and we want to be funny and we want to be personable, but we also need to be professional. Doesn't mean we need to be dry, but we really need to be respectful of other humans, whether they're in the room or not. All right. Something I heard was that you are evaluated, not always, but you're sometimes evaluated from the second you step out of your car. Now, I've never been the one to look out the window and wait to see my interviewees walking into the building. I've never done that. But I've heard of some people that do. And so, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I've heard that it happens. You may have heard the story a few years ago, I think, of the person who was on a subway or train or something, was extremely rude to somebody else. And fast forward about an hour, and that person who was extremely rude walked in to be interviewed by the person who they were rude to, right? You can imagine that didn't go very well. I think we're evaluated by the receptionist when we first come into the building. How do we approach them? Are we rude to them? Are we short with them? I've seen that from people. And I'll tell you what, if you treat my receptionist without respect, that automatically gives you bad marks. I don't think I'm going to enjoy working with you, and I don't think you're going to fit in if you're looking at the person at the front desk as lower than you. Think about how you're going to, in the 1900s, and maybe even just a few months ago, we would shake hands. That's when you would, we don't shake hands anymore in this COVID world, but think about how you're going to do that initial greeting. I've actually had situations where people were like, I go to shake a hand and they do like the elbow thing, right? It used to be a fist bump and that was more hygienic, but now they do the elbow thing, or there's just some kind of weird wave or whatever. But think about how you're going to approach that so it's not too weird. And then the last thing I wrote about first impressions and logistics is how you sit. And when I'm at my job, I'm a sloucher. Like I just kind of settle and melt into my chair. But when I'm in an interview, I'm attentive, right? I'm sitting up. Sometimes I'm leaning forward, not too aggressively, but please don't go into an interview and try and impress somebody and just sit back and melt into the chair, because it seems like you just kind of don't care. All right, the main thing that I want you to think about with the first impressions and the logistics is really put some time into it and plan it out. It's something that you really need to plan and think about before you get there. All right, next topic is interview questions. So the big question that I want you to think about for every question that you're asked is, why are they asking me this question? Okay, so every question should have a purpose, and probably the purpose will fall into one of these two camps. Can this person do the job? I'm asking this question to see if they're technically proficient, or will this person fit into our organization? Sometimes I'll ask a question and they don't really care about what your answer is. They care about how you think through it and present it, right? So if you're asked something that seems impossible or something that might seem frustrating, maybe they're trying to push some buttons and see if you're getting flustered or how you're going to react in a more of a high pressure situation, right? And so when you go into an interview, you shouldn't necessarily think what's the right answer to every question, but why am I being asked this question and how can I best communicate a proper response to help show that yes, I am proficient, or I can learn, or I will fit into this organization. When you think about what your answers, your responses are to questions, the thing I want you to think about is, how can I frame my response for this job? That's one of the earlier mistakes that I made in the interview process, where I would be asked a question, hey, Jason, can you do this? Or have you ever done this? Or tell me about a time when. And I would answer their question, but I wouldn't relate it back to the job that I was interviewing for. And that's one of the maybe more advanced tips that I've come across over the years is every time you answer a question, even the question, tell me about yourself, okay? So if somebody asks you to tell them about yourself, tell them about yourself, whatever you've prepared, right? Hopefully you've prepared that, but whatever you prepared, but try and guide that back into the role, right? So if someone's like, well, tell me about yourself, and you're like, oh yeah, so, I spent a few years doing this, and I spent a few years doing that, and then I tried that. And I actually, in this role, I got a lot of experience as a senior developer, where I was creating and leading more projects, right? So you want to make sure that you have that title in mind, and just about every single question should tie back into the title. Okay, so by the way, it's not an assumed tie-in. You're not saying something and assuming that they're going to pick up on that connection. You actually should say, and this has helped me become a better whatever the role is that you're going for. All right, so there are a few different types of questions. I did a quick Google search on different types of interview questions. There's actually really two. If you look at the lists of types of questions, so there's behavioral questions. And these are going to be, tell me about a time when you've done this. I want to know if you have integrity. I want to know if you have attention to detail. I want to know if you can work on a team. I want to know if you can work with customers, or you can present to bosses, or I want to know if you can do all of those things. And those are behavioral things. What are the things that you have done? what is the behavior that I can expect from you? Okay, so that's one type of question. And then most every other question, type of question that I saw, really I would lump under competency or proficiency questions. Okay, so here's the key to this. Oh, actually, let me say there is one more type of question. And I title this as lame questions or lazy questions. This is for the busy hiring manager who has 80 other things that they're working on, and they interview once a year, or maybe they interview 2 or 3 times a year, but this isn't a big part of their job. They've never really had training on how to interview. I remember I went through an interviewing and a job search boot camp, and then I went and did some interviews, and it was so frustrating to have gone through the training on how to interview better and then go into a room and have somebody read a list of 8 questions that they Googled about 4 minutes earlier. Right? They don't even know what the purpose of the questions were. They're not having a conversation. They're just going down this list of questions. And it's kind of it's a very lazy process that they didn't even prepare for. So some of the questions that I put under the lazy or the lame questions, the thing is with these, they might be dumb questions, but you still got to answer them. Right? And so tell me about yourself. I don't hate that question, but honestly, it's just kind of regurgitating what I've already read from your resume and LinkedIn profile and cover letter. The test, right? Because an interview is a test. The test really is, okay, what am I going to learn differently from this person? How are they presenting themselves? How do they communicate? What are their communication skills? What are your greatest strengths? Oh, I hate that question. Worse than that question is, what are your greatest weaknesses? And one of the reasons why I think that's worse is because we all know that what we're supposed to do is take strengths and then make them into weaknesses and then make them back into strengths. Like, it's just a silly game that doesn't even make sense. When I interview, I don't ask those questions. And then there's another question that's kind of funny. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And the funny response is, well, I see myself in your job. And which is like, it's a passive aggressive response, right? It's funny, but these are the stupid questions that you'll find on a quick Google search if you're being lazy and you haven't asked, if you haven't done any research. If you're an interviewee, you need to be more sophisticated sometimes than the interviewer. Okay, so what this means is you're going in and you're going in saying, how do I communicate my proficiencies? And how do I communicate that I'll be a proper match, a good match for this team or this organization? You're selling yourself, right? And so what I want you to do is I want you to figure out, even if they're lazy questions and they don't make sense, I want you to figure out how you can go in and take those questions and guide the conversation back to your proficiencies, what you bring to the table, and that you're a good match for the team or the organization. Question says, how do you answer the strengths and weaknesses question? I do it very quickly. You know, here's my strength. I mean, I practice. I think about that before I go in. What are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? Think about those questions before you go in, script them, have them ready to roll off your tongue so you're not spending too much time on those areas. And I would try and get back to a better conversation, which is, here's one way that I guide it back. I'll say, what are things that the person before me in this role did very well? What are things that you would expect me to do? Or what does success look like in this role? And usually when I ask that question, they're like, oh, that's a good question. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's a good question. You should be asking me. So I'll ask that question, and then we have a conversation around that where I can go back to my proficiencies and my fit, and I, as the interviewee, am now guiding the discussion. If I'm in that lazy interview, I'm going to start working on guiding the interview. Okay, one of the things that I really want to bring out, and I brushed over this, I want you to script your answers. I don't want you to read them when you're in the interview, right? But I want you to have thought about what the questions are, and how you would answer based on that role. Okay, I think it's important that we do that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the mock interview. The second part is I want you to practice saying your answer. And I don't need you to memorize word for word, and I don't need you to get upset with yourself if you mess up what your script was and you say it a little bit differently. I want it to come out natural, but I want you to think about and script and practice before you go in. And I'm talking about these jobs that you really want. I'm talking about the dream job or the dream company or the dream opportunity. These are the ones that you're going to spend time on really preparing. All right, so with that, let's jump over to mock interviews. You know what? I'm going to skip mini stories. We'll come back to that, but let's go to mock interviews real quick. So here's my experience with mock interviews. It was really interesting. This was that 2-day or 3-day workshop that I went to, and everybody knew, hey, tomorrow we're going to do mock interviews. And so we're going to go into this room that has a double-sided mirror, and 2 people are going to go into this fake office, and there's going to be a camera set up, and we can watch through the mirror, and everybody's going to go through this interview process. And from the beginning through a few questions, and it'll be recorded, and then we're going to sit down and we're going to watch everybody's interviews, and we're going to critique them. Doesn't that sound awesome? No, it sounds miserable, horrible. I've never liked mock stuff. I've never really enjoyed that simulated conversation stuff. I always thought that I was pretty good off the cuff, like impromptu. I always felt like I could kind of talk my way out of or into things, and I didn't need to do the mock. Like, I feel uncomfortable in the mock. I needed a real experience, and so here's what I learned. So I went in, I watched the first couple people do it, and then I was like, okay, I'll go next. I go into the room, they start the interview, and I was like, tell me about yourself. And that's pretty much how the whole interview went, right? And so when we go back and watch the recording, I could not believe how many, those are called filler words sometimes. So some of those are filler words. I couldn't believe how many ums and uhs and filler words I had in this experience, even though I thought I was fairly prepared and I thought I was good impromptu. What I learned was, no, you're not. And if you're like me and you think you're good and you don't need to practice, let me tell you, from me to you, you need to practice, right? And so in the olden days, I needed a group of people and I needed that environment, and then we needed to go debrief. But honestly, today, get your phone or get your webcam or whatever, and it can be completely private. You don't have to do it with other people. If you want, and you're crazy, you can do it on Facebook Live or on YouTube Live or whatever. You can actually do it in a social environment and say, hey guys, I'm going to do a mock interview right now, and I would like you to critique my responses. I think that would actually be really fun and weird and very vulnerable. I doubt hardly anybody's going to do it, but at least get your own camera and do your own mock interview, but take it seriously, right? So take the questions and do them for real. It was a phenomenal experience in learning that, no, I was not a good interviewer at all. And yes, I really needed to practice. I needed to understand the why of the questions. I needed to have the foundational understanding of why you're asking that question, because if it's a question I haven't prepared for, I need to answer based on the why, okay? I also knew that there were going to be certain questions like, tell me about yourself, what are your greatest weaknesses? And even though I think those are lazy questions, they're really common. And it's better to prepare for those and figure out how you're going to communicate those than to kind of stumble through them and sound as cliche as everybody else. Let me go back to the question that was asked about how do you answer your strengths and weaknesses questions. Honestly, just for the sake of time, I'm going to say go look that up. I answered it a little bit earlier, but Go look it up. There are a gazillion articles on how to answer those, and they're generally along the same vein. Okay, so that is the mock interviews, and I'm going to tell you right now, I didn't want to do it. I thought it was going to be a waste of time. It was one of the most valuable experiences that I ever did in preparing for an interview. Just a little bit of behind the scenes as a Pluralsight author. Once again, I thought I was pretty good impromptu. And my earlier courses back in 2012 and 2013 were not scripted. I had outlines and I had some notes and maybe even a few phrases that I wanted to use. But generally, I just kind of talked about whatever I wanted to talk about. And it's been in the last few years that I script my courses word for word, which sounds kind of boring, but I'll tell you what, they are way better. I will go through what I'm going to say at least 5 times. And a few of those are out loud to make sure that it really does sound right. And I have a logical, conversation. And I contrast the courses that I do today with that preparation to the courses I did with no preparation. And it's almost embarrassing how bad the ones were compared to preparing. My message isn't that my courses are horrible from the early days, but my message is you will have better responses the more you anticipate and script and practice those, whether you do it in a mock or whether you do it, just in front of a mirror or whatever. Chuck says, how do you sit for a video interview with the camera? Actually, I'm going to hold on to that question for the end. I think that's a really good question. I'm going to hold on to that for when we go into the question phase. All right. So the next topic that I want to talk about real quick is mini stories. Mini stories is one of my favorite tactics that you can use to communicate your proficiencies. And these work exceptionally well with behavioral questions, but I think you can actually, you can use a mini story for almost every question that you get asked. One of the really cool things about mini stories is that your mini stories are perfect for interviews, for job search interviews. But when I do LinkedIn profile consulting, I talk about writing your mini stories in your about me part, your description on your profile, as well as all the jobs that you have. I want you to use mini stories in every single job to talk about proficiencies. Okay, so there are 4 parts to your mini stories. You're going to want to write these 4 parts down. And so this is how it works. Somebody says, Jason, in this role, we really need somebody who has attention to detail. Do you have attention to detail? Now, the easiest answer is yes. That's it, right? Like, that's kind of what most people do for questions without understanding that I'm not asking a yes or a no question, or at least that's not what I want. I want something with teeth. I want something with meat on it. Like, help me really understand and believe that you have attention to detail, okay? And so these are the 4 parts. The first part is yes. Now, you could say yes. I'm okay with you saying yes. What you could also say is, yes, I have good attention to detail. Like I really have attention to detail. It's one of my characteristics. So the first part of 4 is making a claim. The claim is, yep, I'm there. Now, the way you make the claim can be enhanced, right? So a lot of people would say, yes, I have attention to detail. A better way to say that, and this is one of my favorite epiphanies that I came up with a number of years ago, is letting other people say that you have attention to detail, okay? And the way you do that is you say something like, people know me as someone who has attention to detail. Okay, that's people. My boss always commented on my attention to detail. Okay, so now we're talking about a boss, and I'm going to be your boss, and I want to say the same thing about you. My colleagues would always say that I was the one on the team with the most attention to detail. See what I'm doing here? I'm letting other people say it, whether it's a boss or colleagues or customers or people who reported to me. All of these people that I've ever worked with or around, these are the people who are saying that I have attention to detail, okay? You can simply say, I'm known as having attention. So you're not even saying what group of people knows you, but instead of saying I am, you're basically saying these people say I am. And in the interview, I'm not going to write this down and say, well, make sure I talk to the boss about that. I mean, I might do that, but I'm not necessarily thinking I need to vet that. I need to fact check that. But I am thinking, oh, well, he's not just bragging about himself, but other people regularly say this about him. It's a very powerful way of making a claim. Another one you can do, and this goes into my LinkedIn profile course, is you could say, you know, if you go look at my LinkedIn, my recommendations on LinkedIn, you'll see a number of people talk about my attention to detail. Okay. This is a reason why we want to get recommendations on LinkedIn so that we can come back and reference them and say, well, yes, I am a great team worker, or I am a great strategist, or I am good at leading people, or I do have attention to detail. You can see that people are talking about that in the recommendations on my LinkedIn profile. That's going to carry some weight as opposed to simply saying, yes, I am a good team worker, right? So number one, make the claim. And if you want to make it better, have other people make it about you. Number two, 3 and 4, actually, 2, 3, and 4, we launch into what's called a PAR statement: problem, action, result. And so actually, number one is the problem. So we're making the claim. That's what we're doing. Number 2 is the for example, the example. Like, give me an example of when this happened. I was once working on a team where there was we didn't understand why, but there was a lot of rework that had to be done. And I actually went back to the original statement of work and I went through it, and I realized that there were about 4 things that we had neglected. And so that's my for example. I'm finding an opportunity to show when and where in a mini story, like I'm putting context around my attention to detail. As a result, that's part 3. So part 1, make the claim. Part 2 is for example. Part 3 is as a result. As a result, my team was able to recalibrate. We stopped what we were doing, made sure we incorporated those 4 points of the statement of work that everybody else had overlooked, and then we were able to actually deliver the project on time, right? So I'm telling a story. This, if you were to write your mini story, this is going to be about 3 or 4 lines on LinkedIn. And it really could be 3 or 4 sentences. These are short, hence mini, right? We want to keep this really short because we want to communicate a lot of these. There's one more part that I learned and I love. So normally when I talk about mini stories, there's 3 parts, but I was talking to a career coach who was a delightful lady that was, I think she was in her 80s, and she was just really fun and excited about this stuff. And she says, oh, Jason, there's one more part that I always tell people to use. She says that you say, and what that means for you is I will be able to do that here, or I will add this value to your team, or however you communicate that. But the last part is, and the way I frame this is, we have these dots, right? Like connect the dots. And a lot of times we say A connects to B, connects to C. And then you hope that they understand that it leads to D, but we never connect it to D. And what this career coach taught me was, we can't hope, and we can't anticipate, and we can't assume that they're going to make the connection. In the interview, we have the opportunity to tell our mini story and say, and I know that I can bring that same value to this team. We need to connect that last dot and help them know that instead of guessing that they'll assume or hoping that they'll assume, we connect that dot for and with them. So those are your mini stories. Great for behavioral questions, but really should be applied to almost every other question. Just real quick, I'll review those. Make your claim, I am this, or I do this, or other people say that I am. For example, as a result, and what this means for you. Those are the 4 parts of the mini story. These are not limited to just your interview. I said you can use them on your LinkedIn profile. On my notes, I wrote down that you can also use them in your cover letter. You can absolutely include them in your follow-up. So when you have a follow-up from your interview, you should be responding back at least with an email. And in that email, you could say something like, I actually had a thought as I was leaving. You asked me about this thing, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about that. I actually have experience in this area. For example, I was working on this project or with this team or whatever, here's what I did as a result. And what you can make that mini story part of your follow-up. Isn't that awesome? And then of course your LinkedIn profile. All right, so let's go into the last topic, and then we're gonna wrap this up and go into questions. Okay, so the last thing is follow-up. And like I said, if you've watched any of my courses on Pluralsight, follow-up is gonna be like the broken record player. I am a nut for follow-up, and here's why. Keith Ferrazzi, who wrote one of my favorite, he's actually my #1 favorite networking book called Never Eat Alone. Keith Ferrazzi, I think in a blog post said, in this I've quoted on my blog a number of times, if you want to be better than 95% of your competition, all you have to do is follow up. Sounds easy, right? It sounds like the number's too high, but I'll tell you, from everything that I've experienced in my career, people don't follow up. You intend to, and you have a good heart and you have good intentions, but you don't write it and hit send. Nobody does. And so if you want to stand out, all you have to do is follow up. I was actually reading this article, I don't remember where it was, but sometime this week, that said something like, why should you send a positive and a kind follow-up after your interview if you didn't get the job? And one of the answers was, well, you never know if the person who did get the job declined the job, or if they got the job and within a few weeks they left for whatever reason, right? And if you are the one who was still in the running and you left a positive impression because you followed up, you're going to stand out more than other people, okay? So whether you follow up with an email, with a text message, which I would only do if you have been communicating via text before, right? I would not take their mobile number from their business card away from the interview and then text them a follow-up. Generally, I wouldn't do that. Maybe the younger generations do that, and maybe that's fine. I would feel a little uncomfortable doing that. Definitely, I would do an email. I found that if you send a card, I mean, we're going back to the 18 and 1900s, right? This is a long time ago. If you send a card, you will be one of the 0.001% of people who ever send a card. Here's a recommendation. Go down to wherever you can buy a card. I actually went to Walmart a few years ago and I got a box of like 30 generic thank you cards. It just said thank you on the front, and then it had an envelope, and I use those thank you cards for various reasons. I have a book of stamps and I have a pile of thank you cards, and I can easily whip out a card, put it in the mail, and be done. I mean, it's not as fast as sending an email, but if I have the stack of cards with me, and those cards were inexpensive, you guys, the stamps were inexpensive. My problem is I need them next to me. And if I have them next to me, I just write it real quick, shoot it in the mail. And even if I don't get a reply, I know that I've gone way above and beyond what most people do. And it hasn't cost me hardly any time or any money. All right. One of the reasons why I want you to follow up is I want you to think about every relationship that you have. which means those interviews, right? The interview might be the first time that you ever met the person, but I want you to think about those as the beginning of developing a professional relationship. This is networking. Even if they say no, you never know if that person sitting on the panel is deciding to leave the company and go somewhere else. And they're maybe looking at you thinking, I wonder if this person would be a good fit for my other company. You never know if the other person sitting next to them is going to get let go the next day, right? Our world right now is so mobile. People are not staying at a company for 20 and 30 and 40 years. People are moving around a lot. And so every professional interaction that we get to have with people, we need to take advantage of that and think not, oh, this is Jane from this company, right? And maybe I can get a job there. No, I didn't get a job there. So Jane is, she doesn't mean anything to me anymore. We need to move beyond that thinking and think, oh, I met Jane at this company in this interview. I wonder where she's at now. I wonder how I could help her, or maybe she could help me, right? We need to think about these interactions that we have as the beginning of long-term professional relationships. And it starts with the first follow-up, and then we can actually have multiple follow-ups. Even after we get or don't get the job, we can continue follow-ups and that nurturing the professional relationship. The last point that I want to make real quick is on your follow-up, calendar it. If you have an interview on Tuesday, then calendar on Thursday or Friday that you're going to send a follow-up. And there's a question in here about the timing on that. We'll get to that in just a second. All right. So if you're not a Pluralsight user, you can go into any page on Pluralsight and you'll see a button to get a 10-day trial. It's actually 10 days or 200 minutes, but it's pretty easy to go find your 10-day trial. Let's jump over to the questions. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the question box on Zoom. And so I'm just going to go through these real quick. So Chuck says, how do you sit for a video interview on camera? Notice that I'm actually about 12 inches away from my camera, which I don't know. I don't feel like I'm too close to you, but I don't want to be back here. Like this is just too far away. I'm looking at my screen and I cover, like my head covers maybe like 10% of the whole thing. I want to be involved and engaged, and I want to read body language. And if I'm too far back, I'm not really getting much body language. Okay. So, with video interviews, again, you go out and Google that, and there's a lot of articles about how to optimize your video interview. I would say make sure that you have really good light. And also, you can't see this, but in my office over here, I have 2 windows that are open. And then over here, I have 2 lights. And I'm not saying you got to buy lights for video interviews, but I do video stuff. And so I invested in the lights. They're not that expensive. They're probably 20, 30 bucks. I actually did a video interview with somebody who became a friend of mine. And she had behind her was her window. And so our first video call that we had she was silhouetted. Okay. So you just want to consider what you're going to look like, what's in the background. Are there any distractions, things like that. And then I would just sit and have more of my head taking up the screen than really anything else. And here's something really weird in the video interview. You're actually talking to the camera. So don't talk to what you're looking at. Try and have good eye contact with the camera. It's weird to do that, but I think you'll get used to it. All right, Chuck, thanks for the question. Again, there's a lot of YouTube video as well as articles all over the place about how to optimize as an interviewee, how to optimize your video interview. I actually was on a, what was it called? Oh yeah, HireVue. HireVue is a system that companies will subscribe to, and then they ask questions. And the first time I did HireVue interviews was so weird because what they do is they ask like, say, 8 questions or whatever. And it's like, okay, you have 30 seconds to answer this question. And it's like 30 seconds. Okay, ready, set, go. You push the button, you read the question, you think about what you're going to say, you push the button, and it counts down 29, 28, 27, and it gets down to 3, 2, 1. And it's like, I still have 10 seconds that I need to talk about, right? So you're like, okay, try again. And I remember the first time I did a HireVue interview, there was I probably did try again on half the interview because I was like, oh crud, how do I really make this really concise? So there's actually a lot of tricky stuff about these video interviews, but talk to the camera. That's who that's what they're going to see, the eye contact. I'll tell you a real quick tip. When I went in for a second interview at this company, after I did the hire view, the comment that they said was, Jason, you're the first person who has ever used our names in responding to the questions. So what I did was I looked at the person asking the questions, found out what their name was, went to LinkedIn, did a little bit of research to see who I was even talking to, right? And then when there was a question, I would say something like, well, Ryan, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. Or I don't know if I said or not, but anyways, I said, well, Ryan, and that really impressed them. Didn't impress them enough to get me the job, but I actually stood out because they talked about that when I went in. All right, anonymous says not the anonymous, lowercase anonymous, where's the line between following up and going too far? Most companies never get back to you. I'm gonna tell you right now, the job search process and the hiring process is broken everywhere. It's broken from the beginning to the end for job seekers, for recruiters, for hiring managers, for HR. The whole job search process is an absolute mess, okay? Most companies never get back with you. It's because they're broken. Most companies don't give you proper feedback and you're like, well, why didn't I get the job? Or what could I have done better? And then they ghost you. It's because the whole process and the whole system is broken. So first of all, you can't have really big expectations of how you're going to communicate. I remember I was in an interview process where there was a lot of really good communication, had the first interview, had the second interview, everything was going well. I got a canned, we've decided to go with somebody else rejection notice. And then I was ghosted. From then on, even though we had great conversations offline, through email, and I think even through text, and I thought we were developing a cool relationship, that person completely ghosted me. This is an indication that there is massive opportunity to fix the process, although I've been in this field for 15 years now, and I don't think it's going to get fixed. What we can do is figure out how we are going to be principle-based and professional. How are we going to follow up? When are we going to follow up? When is it going too far? When it's inappropriate, when it gets creepy, when it feels like we're stalkers, right? If I reach out to somebody 2 or 3 times and they don't respond, I'm not probably going to go for a 4th or definitely not a 5th time, right? I'm going to take the hint and I'm going to walk away and say, that just didn't work out. I might network into somebody who can give me some more information about that. But there comes a point where it's like, okay, you got to move on. You got to move on. This morning, I was looking at a question on Quora that said, what do you do after the interview and you're waiting to hear back? And my immediate thought was, go find another interview. Like if you're in sales and you make a big sale, what do? You go find another sale. Okay. So one of the mistakes that I think we can make as job seekers is we're like, oh my gosh, this is the perfect job. I'm the perfect candidate. I'm for sure going to get it. I'm going to focus all my time on it. I'm going to mentally start doing that job. That's one of the problems that I have is I start mentally jumping in and actually doing the job. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, I found out I didn't get the job, and I basically did nothing to progress my job search between now and then. Okay, so instead of worrying too much about trying to follow up with that person, look for your next opportunity. Okay, the other thing is you might try one more different tactic. So maybe that is instead of emailing, you call or leave a voicemail or something like that, because maybe they went on vacation, maybe they went on maternity or paternity or just something that like really took them out of their normal, and you need to somehow get on their radar and not be one of the 300 emails that they're trying to catch up on, right? So, maybe try one more different thing. I actually, I don't love voice calls because unless I'm prepared, I don't hate them, but a tactic that I found, that I heard about, that I really like this idea, especially for shy or introverted people, is leave a voicemail. So call somebody's office at like 10 or 11 at night or 5 in the morning. And when they're not going to, or Saturday, right? Call them when they're not going to be there. And then just leave a voicemail. Hey, this is Jason. I sent you a couple emails. Just wanted to follow up. Not sure if you saw those or they got buried, but I wanted to follow up on this. And then the last thing that I'll say for anonymous about, where's the line that you don't want to cross, is the initial follow-ups are usually, where are we at? Like, are you going to hire me? Do I get to come in for the next interview? You don't say those words, but that's kind of what you're after. But going back to my idea that these are long-term professional relationships that we want to nurture, is I would try and figure out, okay, didn't work out, but in a quarter, like in 3 months from now, I'm going to ping them, not for that job, but just, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but we interviewed a few months ago for that position. Hope the person's working out. I just wanted to give you a quick update on where I'm at. And I remember you were working on this weird project, and how is it going? Or here's an article that made me think about you, or something like that. That's how you nurture and create those long-term professional relationships, which can be really valuable. All right, thank you for that question. Let me jump over to Dave. How do we follow up with the hiring company manager when we landed the interview through a third-party recruiter? That's a great question. So if you don't know, third-party recruiters have a really weird relationship with hiring managers. Okay, they get paid if you get hired. Normally they'll get like a finder's fee. A lot of times it's a percentage of your first year of salary. It doesn't come out of your salary, but it's just an additional cost that the employer pays to bring you on. First thing I would do is go back to your third-party recruiter, assuming that you have a good relationship with them, and say, hey, I had an interview. I thought it went really well. I'd love for you to find out, what they thought, and what do you think about me following up with them? I don't think that your recruiter is always on your team, because their whole thing is, how do I get a commission? Who can I get hired? Okay. And maybe they have 2 other people that are better than you, that they're trying to pitch harder than they're trying to pitch you. So you're not their best friend, and they're not your best friend, but they definitely can be a part of some kind of a part of your team. And so I would have that question with them. What do you recommend? Do you think I can follow up with this person, or should I, or shouldn't I? And then you need to make your own decision. If a recruiter says absolutely don't follow up with them again, that's weird. First of all, I think that'd be weird, but I would wonder, do they have my best interest in mind? And if I connected with somebody in that interview process, in any level of interview that I was in, if I connected with somebody at a professional level, I want to follow up with them, whether I think I'm going to get the job or not. Right. So I would say have that conversation with your recruiter. But if they say no, you still have a choice to make on whether you're going to pursue that or not. Alex says, what is a common interview question that stumps programmers? I don't know. I don't even know how to answer that. I think some people, when I read about the whiteboarding that almost everybody hates, it's people who are like, how am I going, sometimes when I fix a dev program, or I'm working on a program, I remember there was times where I had this thing that I needed to develop and figure out, and I'd sit on it for like 1 or 2 weeks. I do other stuff, and in the back of my mind, I'm like, how do I do that? And then after a week or two, or the next morning, I'd come in, I whip it out in like 5 minutes. Like, here was my problem, and it was like a 2-minute solution, but I needed to think about it for a long time, right? And so if that's you, if that's how you think, getting on a whiteboard and trying to do something in 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 minutes can be really frustrating. On the other hand, I'll tell you what, stereotypically, developers are not good socially. I think there's a lot of changes that are happening now from the 50s and the 60s, but the stereotype is that we don't communicate well, that we're not good with other people, right? And so for some people, they might be able to answer questions about how would you do this in SQL, or how would you address this, but they don't know how to answer questions about the team. One of the problems that I see a lot with teamwork issues is where I'll say, you know, hey, I noticed you worked on a team with this thing. Tell me about that. And people will say something like, well, you know, my team leader did this, and these people on the team did that, and those people did that. And you want to give credit to everybody else that was on the team, and you don't realize that you're the one being interviewed, not them, right? And so that's something that I would say would stump programmers, where they are not recognizing that the purpose of the interview is to assess them and not just figure out if this is a question that is like, tell me how this whole team solved the problem, right? It's weird because when you're in a company, you have to talk about your team. You don't want to take all the credit for something that your team did, right? That's very taboo. But in an interview, you have to completely flip-flop and take credit where credit's due. So I don't know how to answer the question for you, Alex. I guess my question is, what's a common interview question that stumps you? All right, Jim says, are there interview questions that should not be asked or answered? Yeah, absolutely. They're in the United States, there are illegal questions. I've actually worked with teams from various countries overseas, and I'll see resumes with age, so birthday. I'll see resumes with pictures and religion. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, holy cow, this is so illegal in the US. Like, we're not allowed to do this or talk about this. I have been in interviews where on the interviewer side of the table, and one of my colleagues would ask illegal questions, and very uncomfortable. As an interviewer, I stop that, because that can get you into a lot of trouble. And I've actually been in a situation where we got there was almost a lawsuit. I'm very, very sensitive to what you can and can't answer. Because of my experiences, I am very, very careful. Like, if I were to be asked questions like that, that's a red flag for me. Like, do I want to work at a company where the owner or one of the owners or somebody high up is dumb enough to ask illegal questions, right? You could respectfully decline a question. You could twist it. You could say, well, you know, that's actually one of those questions that legally shouldn't be asked. But let me approach it this way. And you can actually answer a question very tactfully and very professionally without like saying, I'm not going to answer that. That's illegal, right? But for me as an interviewee, that's going to be a yellow or a red flag, where I'm looking at that saying, okay, maybe this isn't the company that I thought it was going to be. Jan says, I did not move forward after a screening interview. I found out after the fact that the position was wired. I sent a thank you email, did not receive a response. What do you recommend to include in this kind of email to get a response with feedback on the interview? I don't know what wired means, that the position was wired. What do you recommend to include in this kind of email to get a response with feedback on the interview? I'll be honest with you. If you get feedback from any interviewer, it'll be a miracle. Like, it happens, and some people do it, but I just wouldn't expect it. I think it's important, Jan, that you do mock interviews. And if you have friends, peers, and colleagues in your industry that can be involved in those mock interviews, and that they can watch the video with you, not just ask you questions and have you go through the questions, but actually sit back and watch the video and critique your body language and your filler words and your presentation. That's where you're going to get real feedback. Getting feedback today is too fraught with legal issues. You know, HR is telling people, if you're not hiring them, you don't communicate with them, right? And that's why nobody's getting feedback, which really stinks, because we want feedback and we want to be treated as humans and we want to have good communication. But the legal eagles are saying, sorry, but that's where we're going to get into trouble. And so you can't give that type of feedback. So really, I'm not surprised that you're not getting feedback. So don't spend too much time. Just move on and try and figure out the mock interviews. All right. Let me just make sure I'm getting to the right question here. Anonymous says, quick question, would you be able to share some ways for a thank you email, especially for a tech interview, when you interview with 4 to 5 people, but you only have the email address of the recruiter? Would it be good to say, please convey my sincere thanks? Absolutely. I would totally say if you only have one email message. The other thing though is when you go into that interview and you're introduced, you should, what I do is I have a piece of paper to take notes, okay? And what I'll do is I'll write down the names of the people and anything I can, like first and last name and maybe role, and I'll do that where they sit. So if we're at a table and there's somebody here and here and here, on my paper, I'm gonna write down Sam and Jim and Jane, so that during that conversation, I want to talk to this person. I'm not like, oh crud, I listed them, I don't remember who's who. Now I can visually see who's who. So I would write those down, and then you can go back on LinkedIn and probably find those people, you know, unless the company is really big. But yeah, if you only have the email address of the recruiter, I would absolutely say, you know, send them a real follow-up as if the recruiter was going to forward it to the team, because a lot of times the recruiter will do that. All right, I think there was a question that just got erased. There was a follow-up question to that just got bumped over to answered, so I'm not seeing that. And that says, I usually send a thank you note the day after. Is there a different follow-up you're referring to, like a week later? So what I would do is I would send that first thank you the day after. I think that's fine. You could even do it that day. I don't think that's necessarily bad. And then I would do a week later and maybe another week or a month later or something like that, thinking about the long-term professional relationship. Samirth says, and thank you for the pronunciation of your name. Samirth says, I have been in the same company, my first company, for almost 6 years now. I had planned to make the switch in 2020, but COVID kind of changed that, right? COVID kind of changed a lot of things. Is it safe to make a switch right now, or should I stay in the company where my skills are proven and I feel a little safe? Well, I probably wouldn't make a change to, you know, these industries that are getting really, really hard hit. But there are a lot of companies that are hiring, and I've actually seen some industry related lists of companies that are hiring right now. If I had a dream company and a dream role and a dream boss, I would look at making a change. I mean, what's to say that your company you're in now is as safe or secure, quote unquote, as the company that you're looking for? So I would definitely go in and evaluate the organization based on their industry and how hard they are being hit by, you know, the current events. But I wouldn't say that you need to sequester yourself right now. What I absolutely would not recommend is quitting without having something else to go to. This is not a good time to think, okay, I'm just going to go get another job, because you're going to be competing with a lot of highly qualified people. So thank you, Samirth, for that. Oh, the position is wired. They already know who they are going to hire, but they have to interview other people anyway. Yeah, I hate that. Is there a handy FAQ or list of some basic illegal questions that are encountered? Yep, easily go online, Phil, and look on Google or whatever, and look up illegal interview questions. And there is a list, there's categories of what is illegal, and then there's examples. There's tons of those lists because HR people are looking for them all the time. What is an ideal CV? What does an ideal CV look like for a developer looking for job opportunities overseas? I'm gonna table that one. If you email me that question, then I'll try and respond on my blog. But we're getting really close to the time, and we don't have enough time, and it's outside of the scope of today. But send me an email, and I'm at jason@jibberjobber.com, and I'm happy to create a blog post for you. Anonymous says, thank you for your answer on the thank you email. A quick follow-up question. If I know the company doesn't share feedback since it's against their policies, can I ask for feedback be taken against you, or is it harmless to ask for it? Look, if you want to ask for it, ask for it. I wouldn't expect that anybody answers it. Anonymous says, thank you for your, oh, sorry, that was just one. Yeah, go ahead and ask for it, but don't expect it. Don't expect it. Phil says, thank you. Looking forward for the next session. Folks, I am too. Thank you so much for staying on. I'm looking at the numbers and pretty much everybody that came stayed. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about personal branding. To be honest with you, interviewing is my least favorite topic out of these 6. So I'm excited to have talked about this and shared this with you, but man, I can't wait for personal branding and some of the other stuff. Please go out and share this with your friends. There are a lot of people who are hurting. There are a lot of people who are nervous, scared to death. They need hope. They need inspiration. And I'm not going to say that I have all the right answers, but I hope that I can share some hope with each of you and your friends. So please share this interview series on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Go knock on your neighbor's door. Let them know that Pluralsight is sponsoring this, and we'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Thank you.